Well, good afternoon. If you are in the wonderful city of Chicago, Illinois, my second favorite American city. Good afternoon in New York, my favorite American city, and greetings to people all over the Americas. Greetings to people all over Europe, where classical music was born, at least the way we know it now. In France, in Italy, in Austria, in Germany, Russia, all the countries that we call the motherland of classical music. Greetings to people in Africa and people all over the world, especially people who work for justice. That is something that I care about, and we in our world need to care about very actively. Speaking of justice, my guest is James Ginsburg. He goes by Jim Ginsburg. He's the son of a very famous justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Martin Ginsburg, a very established, very important lawyer. But Jim took the music route. And that's really what we're going to talk about today primarily. So, Jim, welcome.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
Sure. So, I just have a couple of questions I want to ask you about your upbringing. One is my mother asked me to show this to you. This is her mask from
Ah, yes, yes.
from the highlight of the pandemic. Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Martin Ginsburg, who every American knows and should respect. They are great Americans. They were great Americans, and famous not only in your mother's case for her career as a justice on the Supreme Court, but for her very open and active love of music, your father as well.
Mhm.
And so I would like to start by wondering, in your home growing up, how is music integrated, incorporated into the family life?
Um, Music was always playing in the household. And from a very young age, my parents were taking me to various concerts, such as the Little Orchestra Society, which was at Hunter College across the street from where we lived. That was very convenient. And the Light Opera of Manhattan that did the Gilbert and Sullivans, and the Young People's concerts at the New York Philharmonic, which back then were conducted by Michael Tilson Thomas, not too shabby. And I just soaked it all up like a sponge and quickly graduated to the New York City Opera and the Met, and just enjoyed all of it. There was a piano in the house. Every once in a while, Mom would sit down and play an arrangement of the Minuet from Don Giovanni. I did take piano lessons, but I was more interested in the record collection, in the phonograph. They had all the classics like the Toscanini, Beethoven symphonies and whatnot. And by age 7, I started collecting my own to expand the repertoire.
So I imagine that WQXR radio, which
Oh
was and
yes,
is New York's classical music station,
very
was
very much so. Yeah.
at that time. I know you were born in 1965, I think.
Mhm.
WQXR had an AM and an FM side,
Yeah.
and I've been on WQXR for a long time. And WQXR FM was music.
Right.
AM often had talk shows about music, and it had people such as Carl Haas and Robert Sherman,
Mm.
and many people who would spend the whole day talking, and George Jelinek very famously.
Oh
And
yes.
musicians passing through New York or living in New York would come on and talk about their latest recording, their latest interest, their desire to go play chamber music in Tanglewood, or Isaac Stern playing with the new violin, that kind of thing. And classical music, when you were a little boy, was still very much part of the public conversation in New York City, thanks primarily to WQXR AM, but also because there were many venues, some of which you mentioned, where a New York City kid could go and partake of classical music.
Mhm.
To what degree do you feel that formed the person you are?
Oh, hugely. And I would add to QXR, of course, back then we had 3 classical stations because we had WNCN and the public station, and WNYC was a classical station
Yep.
as well. So there was lots to
And
hear about.
Columbia University's radio station also played a lot of classical and opera,
Mhm.
WKCR.
Oh,
Fordham
right.
University, WFUV. I know your mother went to Columbia. Um, so it was very possible. at that time without spending a penny to have a lot of classical music in your life in New York City.
Yep. And we also have
Um,
great record stores.
you all said what?
Great record stores.
Yes, Sam Goody. I never really spoke to anyone about record stores.
Yeah.
So where did you and your family go to buy your records, your LPs?
Well, I was pretty much the record buyer. So of course there was Tower and yeah, sometimes Sam Goody, and of course good old Record Hunter was there too.
Hmm.
Uh, there was again just such a wide variety. I forget. I think it was a little later that I stumbled on Academy Books and Records, but
Yeah.
that's a favorite place for me to visit when I come to New York.
Now you said that you grew up near Hunter College. Did your parents have an apartment big enough to hold all of your LPs?
Yeah, well, the collection wasn't that big. Yeah, we lived at on 69th and Lex, so
Hmm.
just kitty corner to the Hunter College, and right in the heart of the Upper East Side.
And when your parents had music on, I was my both my parents, but especially my father, were deeply into music. My mother worked at Lincoln Center. My dad was a musician, and he would talk to me. He would say to me, "Listen to this passage," or "This is what Mozart wanted to do here," or "Listen to that viola in Berlioz right there." And it was my dad and I had an ongoing conversation about music for his entire life that I was in. And it was teaching and learning, but it was never about passing a test, so to speak. It was
Yeah.
about developing a love and a knowledge and developing an ear. And we could speak very openly about the fact that there were composers he didn't care for. And he would
Mhm.
explain to me why. Sometimes I would agree with him. Even if I didn't agree with him, I would take his point very seriously. And so I, as a little kid and a not so little guy, thought about music, and music was in my head all the time. And music was something that I evaluated, not critically necessarily, but it was something I wanted to know more about and hear. And it always seemed like it was a never ending world of fascination. I don't know your experience with your parents. Did they actively have you listen, or were you really the one who just took off and ran with it?
Mostly the latter. Mom used to like to say, James was a lively child, which meant I was hyperactive. But they discovered very quickly that if they put classical music on the phonograph, I stopped running around like the Tasmanian devil and actually sat up and listened.
Hmm.
So, and I mentioned them taking me to all these things. And for example, and you talked about talking about the music. The biggest example of that was before we would go to the Met. And this is, of course, long before the days of super titles. We would open up the Victor Book of the Opera and go over the plot and everything to expect, so that I had a good idea of what was going on and what they were singing about. Obviously, not in most cases being able to understand the words, and with Mozart especially because that was my parents' favorite composer. So we listened to the great Cesare Siepi recordings of Figaro and Don Giovanni quite regularly in the household as well.
Now, at a certain point, when your mother came onto the Supreme Court, when she moved to Washington, and I saw her not up close, but I saw her often at the Kennedy Center.
Mhm.
And she once was in an opera production at Washington National Opera of La Fille du Régiment, if I remember. And she was also at Glimmer Glass, which is in upstate New York in Cooperstown, and did a talk, I believe. I didn't hear it, I heard a recording of it, about opera and the law and how law and order is discussed in opera. And in Rigoletto, for example, um, he says, "You are crime and I'm the punishment," things like that. My question for you is, both your parents were attorneys and lawyers and a judge. Um, did they talk about, I want to know how they structured or instructed you and your sister about right and wrong, and whether
Hmm.
music came up as examples of, this character did this, and was opera used as a teaching tool?
Not so much. The opera and law thing came much later, but it was mom did that in many places. She even did once in here in Chicago for WFMT. But law was always the subject of dinner table conversation. Usually, what cases mom was working on in her days running the Women's Rights Project at the ACLU. Every once in a while, we let dad talk about a tax case. He was a tax lawyer. So I don't think there was any sort of direct instruction, but you learned a lot just listening to them talking about aspects of the law through the cases mostly mom was working on.
So, a couple more questions about them because it's how you were formed.
Yep.
I met your mother only once. It was at what used to be called Avery Fisher Hall at Lincoln Center. Now it's David Geffen Hall, home of the New York Philharmonic.
Mhm.
And I wrote a book called Opera 101, which is a very popular textbook in America for learning opera. And she bought a copy
Oh,
and came over to me and asked, would I sign it?
oh, wow.
And so I signed it to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, my judicial diva, Fred Plotkin.
Oh, yes. She loved to be.
And she liked that very much. And we spoke briefly about Mozart, in fact, that
Mhm.
my favorite Mozart opera happens to be La Clemenza di Tito. And she asked me why. And I said, because it's about truth and reconciliation. It's about finding when everything seems to be going wrong, potentially wrong, finding the courage to do the right thing. And she nodded and she said, thank you. And I think her favorite was La Notte di Figaro, if I remember.
It would be, she went back and forth between Figaro and Don Giovanni.
Both magnificent. I have a question about your dad.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know, I've written 8 cookbooks, and I understand that he was a wonderful cook.
Oh, yes.
Would you talk about your father and being the person in the household who made the food?
Yeah. So growing up, actually, for like everyday meals, they would split the duties. But as soon as we were able to push mom out of the kitchen, we were very happy to do so because she was a terrible cook. And this was well known. In fact, when my parents got married, my mother's double cousin, because her brothers married two sisters, um, Richard, who grew up with her practically like a brother, sent my father the Escoffier cookbook as a wedding present, basically saying, "You'll need this." And when my father was stationed at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in the Army, he spent the time going page by page through that cookbook,
Mm.
which helped him develop into the chef he became. And he was really celebrated for his cooking, and I can certainly attest to that. In fact, when he passed away, the other Supreme Court spouses, led by Martha Ann Alito, published a cookbook called Chef Supreme with favorite Marty Ginsburg recipes and also lots of fun stories and pictures of the family and whatnot. It's actually the best-selling item in the Supreme Court gift shop.
Even more than the Constitution?
I, um, well, that's a good question. I'd have to check on that, but I've been told that, just in terms of sales figures, and I mean, it's probably cooled off since, but at least back when it was launched, I mean, they had to keep reprinting because there was so much demand for it.
I wouldn't be surprised. Um, and you reminded me of something, and then we're going to go deep into music.
Okay.
This is an international program, so people elsewhere may not have heard of someone named Bella Abzug, who you probably
Oh.
came across. Bella
Yeah.
Abzug was my congresswoman. She ran for mayor and governor, and she was a feminist. And I guess your mother knew her at a certain point. And she was a dynamic speaker. She didn't mince words. And she also didn't mince meat as a chef. I was a volunteer in her campaign before I was old enough to vote. And she grew up in the Bronx, and her father was a butcher. And what I'm about to say, I'm not making up. The name of the father's butcher shop was the Live and Let Live Butcher Shop. And she grew up cooking meat a lot. And she made a chili that was for the kids, so to speak. In other words, the children of my age, young people who were not old enough to vote. She would make chili on Sundays because we're volunteers. And I said to her, Bella, you stick to your campaign and your politics. I will make the chili. And from that point forward, I made the chili. But she was quite the figure as well. And she
Mhm.
also loved music. So let's get into music.
All
I
right.
know that you went from New York to study at the University of Chicago, a wonderful school on the south side of Chicago in Hyde Park. Um, and you, I think, were on the course to study law. And then you were derailed or made the choice to go toward music. How did that happen?
I should note there was 3 years in Washington in between, because, as my father liked to say, my mom got a good job, and that was the appeals court back then. So, and actually, those were pretty formative years too. But as far as the University of Chicago went, I went there undergrad, majored in economics, basically because that's what you do at the University of Chicago.
Yep.
Uh, then came back to New York actually for a couple of years, and then decided to come to law school, but also, and we can get into all the reasons why I decided to start a record label, but also decided to start a record label at the same time, and very quickly decided that I much preferred producing recordings to studying law books, and so I'm a proud law school dropout. I made it about halfway through before I gave it up for good.
Now, if I'm correct, you created your record label at the age of 24.
Uh, actually, the first recording sessions I was 23, but the label didn't launch until I was 24. Yeah.
How does that happen? Not
Well, it
because
was
of the age, but just because, you know, I mean, a lot of people accomplish a lot of things by their early 20s, but nonetheless, creating a recording label, a company, is not typical.
no.
It's great, but it's not typical. Yeah.
Well, it's a lot of things came together, and one of them was just my experience in Chicago in the mid 1980s as an undergrad. I would go to concerts or hear a live broadcast on WFMT from local artists, and then I would go over to Rose Records to find their recordings, and there were none. Literally, back then, the only recording activity in the classical side in Chicago was the symphony under Sir George Solti. But all the local artists and ensembles were being completely ignored by the record labels that were basically based in New York or on the West Coast. And I thought, well, this is really unfortunate because, growing up in New York, if you went to a concert in Alice Tully Hall, you walk across the street to Tower Records and, you can find lots of recordings by whatever
Yeah.
artist it was. So I thought somebody should do something about this. And I thought, well, I actually have a bit of a background here because of my experience. I did some work I worked for None Such Records a summer after my junior year in college, which was an amazing experience. And I continued to do independent projects after that because they seemed to like what I did. I ran the classical format for the campus radio station at University of Chicago, WHPK. I had done some work in music.
Woodlawn, Hyde Park, Kenwood.
That's right. Very good.
Yeah.
Um, I had done some work in music PR in that period between college and law school, but the main thing was I had been reviewing albums for American Record Guide. I'm a specialist in Shostakovich and other Soviet composers for them, which I really like doing. But what I discovered in the process was there was such a huge difference in terms of the quality of production from some recordings to others. And in fact, that could often be the determinative factor of whether it was actually a good and enjoyable recording, more so than even necessarily who the artist was. Because if a recording was poorly engineered, you couldn't tell what the artist was doing. And again, I also working for None Such. I got to sit in on some recording sessions, including Max Wilcox producing some of Richard Good's Beethoven, which was truly amazing. So to put that all together, I thought, okay. I also happen to know an amazing recording engineer who I went to undergrad with. In fact, he and I used to do shows together at WHPK. We did the first compact disc show. I would bring in, as I joked, my portable CD player. I would literally roll it in from my apartment on a luggage cart. And this was the summer of '84. I was like the first person on campus to have a CD player.
Mhm.
But anyway, he was an amazing, I don't know how, because the University of Chicago doesn't have an engineering department. And yet here he was, and he had been doing work in broadcast engineering, including for WFMT after college. And so I had this idea, well, somebody should be recording these local artists. And Bill surreptitiously sent me some of the on-air tapes from WFMT so I could hear who was playing lately and make a choice about who I might want to record, and quickly settled on this incredible Russian emigre pianist, Dmitry Paperno. And that became the first recording. So I actually started the label with just the one album. Dmitry Paperno plays Russian piano music. And that came out just as I was entering law school. And then instead of taking a summer job after a year of law school, I used the summer to produce more recordings and add Easley Blackwood of the University of Chicago, who's both a pianist and composer, and David Schrader, continuo player around town, played harpsichord, organ, piano, forte piano, but basically everything, played with every ensemble in town. So, and those recordings came out pretty well. So then after a quarter, I took a leave of absence and produced some more recordings. And
Mhm.
then I took a second leave of absence, which technically I'm still on. Uh, I may have lost my credits by now. And at that point, I decided, okay, it's time to make this my full-time venture. And once I had amassed enough of a reputation for the quality of our work that artists started coming to me and saying, hey, we would like to be recorded. And the mission to record specifically Chicago musicians had remained the mission from day one. I had the ammunition to turn the label not for profit.
Today is August 9th of 2024. It happens to be the 225th show I've done in Fred Plotkin on Fridays, and I'm very happy to have James Ginsburg today as a special guest. Also because I realized that Chicago is a city that I adore. I know it very well. I love it. I went to school there for a while. I worked a lot at the Lyric Opera of Chicago. And yet, for whatever reason, I've not had a Chicago presence on Fred Plotkin on Fridays. So,
Yeah.
Jim, I'd like to take today to really extol the virtues, musical and otherwise, of Chicago. So I'm going to start, but then I'm going to ask you to pick up. Um, Chicago being on Lake Michigan, quote, in the middle of the country. In Illinois, it's not the capital, but it's the largest city. Um, it's one of the great musical centers, not only of the United States, but the world. It's a city that always wants to do better than rivals such as New York and Los Angeles and others. Um, it has had wonderful opera through the years, but several opera companies failed for financial reasons. The current Lyric Opera Chicago opened on November 1st of 1954 and is a wonderful, wonderful company. I was a protege or mentee of artist Kranick, who was the general director for many years, and she really is the person who formed my view about how an opera company should be run. The Chicago Symphony is one of the greatest in the world. I never say what is the greatest, but Chicago Symphony is always ranked among them. Of the so-called Big Five of the United States, Boston, I'll do it alphabetically, Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, New York, and Philadelphia. Chicago very often is ranked number one among the five. I don't go by rankings too much, but the Chicago Symphony is a terrific organization. Chicago is a city of the blues, of rock and roll, of all kinds of music. Um, Black people from mostly the South came north in the Great Migration and brought all kinds of music with them. I think it could be argued that gospel music, the way we know it today, was really born in Chicago in around 1924. And although gospel is sung everywhere, um, a lot of the traditions are in Chicago. Mahalia Jackson lived there for a while. One of my favorites, Albertina Walker, lived in Chicago. And it's a magnificent interactive musical city. It's also a great baseball city, and I love baseball. Um, Great food, great cultural mixing, a wonderful theater city. Um,
Mhm.
Steppenwolf and many, many companies all over Chicagoland, as it's called, or Chicago, as it's pronounced. Um,
Mhm.
it's an incredibly vibrant, thriving city with great neighborhoods, lots of character and personality, and superb architecture. And I always feel that even though it's acknowledged for all these things, it's not quite understood to be the the great city that I think it is. What did I leave out about Chicago?
Oh my goodness. I think you covered it pretty well, but I think particularly we have a strong reputation as a theater city. I think you're right about that. And I would add that at least lately, our early music and contemporary classical music scenes are extremely strong. And then also that I think it's fair to say, and Artist Clinic was an exception to this, but generally there's a real collaborative spirit among Chicago's different musical institutions, and it's really fun the way they will work together and combine on projects and things.
Artists like to collaborate with the Chicago Bulls basketball team and the Chicago Bears football team. I'm not kidding. Because she understood branding.
Yeah.
And Mike Ditka was the coach of the Bears, and Michael Jordan was the great star of the Bulls. And she would do photo sessions with those men and
Mhm.
bring Mike Ditka and Michael Jordan to the opera. And she understood that very well. But I know exactly what you're saying. And I realized I left out a very important component that you mentioned briefly. WFMT radio
Oh, yes,
is a
yes.
wonderful, wonderful resource. One of the greats. There was a fellow for many years there named Steve Robinson who did a superb job. They produced international networks at a
Mhm.
time when many of the New York stations were not doing that. They would have an international radio network for classical music, for opera, and WFNT would put out these wonderful programs all the time that
Mhm.
one could hear beyond Chicago, even before there was an internet. Somehow those networks reached elsewhere. So within that context, Jim, if there was all of this activity, musical activity, cultural activity, how did you establish that your company, Cedille, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly,
Yep.
is the one that would really be Chicago's classical music recording company?
Well, again, it was filling a void. There hadn't been a record label based here since Mercury Living Presence in the 1950s. And they didn't necessarily do Chicago artists so much, although they did some. They did some recordings with the symphony, of course. So literally, that's the thing. We have this incredible wealth of talent. We should also have mentioned the music conservatories because
And
Northwest,
Ravinia, I left out. Ravinia Festival of Summer, yeah.
absolutely, on Grant Park, the nation's great summer orchestra, which has made 7 recordings on CD. And yeah, and you got the great music conservatories in DePaul and Northwestern and Chicago College of Performing Arts at Roosevelt. So you got that wealth of talent as well. And of course the amazing symphony, but a lot of smaller ensembles and orchestras and chamber ensembles and soloists. And in addition to Lyric, there's Chicago Opera Theater and now Haymarket Opera doing the early music, both of which have recorded or CD. So again, there's this incredible wealth of talent and nobody covering it. So
Yeah.
that was kind of a sweet spot that I was able to fill and continue to do so to this day.
Now, part of what I love about the model you created, the artistic model, is that initially, I guess because you couldn't do otherwise, it was for profit. But then at a certain point, I mean, the intention would have been for profit,
It
yes?
was a sole proprietorship run out of on a shoestring out of my dwindling savings.
Right, but the intention would have been that if you could have made a little extra money on one recorded, you'd pay it forward to do another. I'm not saying that you were in it, quote, for the money, but that eventually this became a not for profit model,
Right.
which for people not in the United States listening, this is a whole series of laws that I think are good laws that give advantage to arts institutions and organizations and educational, medical, and others that enable them to create the things that they do without certain burdens of taxation and so on, because what they do is for the public good.
And it makes up for the fact that we do much less government funding of such things here as than they do in Europe.
Yes, yes. So therefore, I would love for you to explain, Jim, how Cedille evolved from ostensibly one where the goal was to make enough money to keep going, to a model that is really a not-for-profit, but nonetheless has become unto itself a cultural institution, which is terrific.
Well, it became clear to me that more funding would be needed to expand the range of what we did. 9 of our first 10 recordings were actually solo keyboard. The other one was cello sonatas. So there's that. And it really crystallized for me when we had the opportunity to make our first orchestral recording, something I, of course, did not have the funds to do on my own. And this was when the Chicago Symphony and the University of Chicago had their centenaries coming up around the same time in the early 1990s. And the symphony had the bright idea to commission the 3 top composers at the University of Chicago at the time to write pieces, one of whom was Easley Blackwood, who wrote his 5th Symphony, which was conducted by James DePriest. And I expressed interest in the possibility of this coming out as a recording. And Henry Fogel, who ran the symphony back then, was nice enough to say, okay, I'll pay for WFMT to record all the concerts instead of the usual 2. What used to happen is typically FMT would record the Thursday and the Saturday. They'd splice between the coughs, and that's what goes on the air. In this case, we got very lucky. They headed on 6 different concerts, the symphony, and 2 of which were after a tour, which actually gave Blackwood a chance to do some minor retouchings to the piece for the last 2 performances. And so we had actually 6 performances to work with, which Mitch Heller, the WFMT engineer, recorded for us. But the deal was we couldn't actually edit the music, couldn't produce it until the orchestral musicians were paid. And of course, the Chicago Symphony musicians commanded top dollar back then. So I watched as the symphony raised money from different sources and realized pretty quickly that with our mission of recording Chicago musicians, we should be doing the exact same thing. And I got some advice from Herman Krawitz, who ran New World Records, which was the only example I knew of back then of a nonprofit record label. So that was
before that was assistant manager at the Met under Rudolph Bing.
How about that? Yeah. Well, he had a connection to that cousin Richard I mentioned earlier, so he was very nice to me. So with that knowledge, I went about the process of creating a board, and we got instant credibility because Henry Fogel agreed to be on that board. And in fact, he is my sole remaining charter board member. Mm-hmm. We've been a nonprofit for over 30 years now. So with that, we were able to start raising money. And I do have to credit my father with being my principal fundraiser for a long time, because he was a very successful tax lawyer. And when he would save a client millions of dollars in taxes, he would often, and the thing was, he was, because he was also a teacher, he taught at Georgetown, so he couldn't command a partnership a stake. He was, quote, of counsel to the firm. So he would suggest to his clients that given that he could only, charge so much, they might make a donation to, quote unquote, his favorite charity. Spit up a lot of friends with wonderful letters promising them a place in heaven if they contributed to the company. But we also did our own direct fundraising. We wrote grants to places like the Aaron Copland Fund for Music. We got money from the Illinois Arts Council and from the city, and put that all together. We were able to actually put together a staff. I was able to put this wonderful recording engineer I mentioned, Bill Malone, who I started with from the beginning, actually on staff. So that he could do all our recordings, because it used to be I had to work, around his actual job. So put that all together with the nonprofit funding, and that that was a very successful model until my father passed away in 2010. And then we had to get really serious about doing our own fundraising and actually creating a development department. And we did a capacity study with a local organization that said, yeah, actually, if people know about your mission, they will be giving you more money. So that's what we've been doing. We've been actually very successful with it.
Well, that's part of what I alluded to, that Chicagoans have a strong sense of pride
Mhm.
about their city. And
Absolutely.
they brag and boast, but it's a quiet, lovely, very charming pride that I like very much. That they feel that, you may not understand us and what makes Chicago great, but nonetheless, it has a lot to offer. And
Mhm.
it genuinely does. Um, so therefore, I think it's a wonderful thing that you're able to do this. What I would like to ask you about now, that I've never really spoke to anybody about who has been a producer of recordings and who runs a record label, is the choices that one makes
Mhm.
in terms of how to produce a recording. And this is a very complicated thing for me, less so for you, but you know all the decisions. But let's assume for now that you are making a compact disc, a CD, as opposed to, say, an LP, or recording directly for streaming, which is a more modern world kind of thing. And you think in terms of, let's say it's not a vocal piece, but let's say it's an instrumental piece. How do you decide where to put the microphones? How do you decide what instrument, if any, is accentuated? How do you decide the surrounding sound, the echo, whatever you want to call it?
Mhm.
How do you decide what might be called warm or cold acoustics or recording technology? I'm sort of putting out words without having specific definitions, because I'd like you to give me your definitions of what your aesthetics are about recording.
Well, I'm very lucky in getting to work with amazing recording engineers, particularly Bill Malone, but I've worked with others occasionally on projects, and I really rely very heavily on them in terms of stuff like mic placement, but also on the musicians. So what we'll typically do, say it's a chamber music recording, we'll set up the microphones the way we think you know works best for getting the right both focus on the individual instruments, but also blend all together. And then I'll say, okay, let's do a representative passage before we get started, recording in earnest. So here's perhaps, letters D to F of the first movement of whatever piece it is in the score. And they'll play it, and then they'll all come back to the listening booth. Sometimes we're in an area where we can actually listen off speakers. More often, they have to put on headphones and then say, now what do you think? And they'll say, oh, that's pretty good, but I want a warmer sound on the viola, or I think the cello doesn't come through enough here. And then you have to decide, okay, is that a volume issue, or is it the mic, the distance to the mic issue? And so there can be some back and forth there, depending on the musician. There can be very little back and forth, or with some musicians who really have a particular idea of what their sound is supposed to be, it can take a few tries to get to what they really want.
Mm-hmm.
But we never start recording until all the musicians are happy with with the way they sound. And then it depends on the venue you're recording in. Some venues give you great acoustics that you can take advantage of. Some venues, frankly, don't, and you have to add a lot more after the fact. And they're great tools for that. They're called plugins these days to our software. And there's of course equalization that can be used. One
What is
violinist.
equalization?
So that has to do with tweaking different frequencies. So, for example, one of the violinists we've recorded sometimes has thought, when we've sent her the initial mix of her recordings, that her violin sounded a little bright. So, okay, we'll take down maybe from 8,000 hertz up. We'll take those frequencies down a bit. That's equalization, and that warms up her sound.
Hmm. Okay. Um, Now, I mentioned the concept of streaming. This
Mhm.
program that I do appears on Idagio internationally, and Idagio is an international streaming service based in Berlin, on which I should add many CD recordings already exist. And you have provided a list of some of your favorites, but all of them can be found on Idagio, and I encourage people to go to idagio.com, idagio.com, to discover these and many more. Um, but when music is streamed, is the technology, is the recording aesthetic different if you know that it will be going out on a stream, being heard through a device rather than, say, a record player or a CD player?
Not really. So what we try to do is record in the highest possible um, sound quality. So that has to do with the sampling rate, which will either be 96 kilohertz. Sometimes if it's orchestral recording with tons of tracks, we'll do 88.2 kilohertz instead, just to try to save a little bit of drive space.
Mhm.
And then the sample rate, which is 24 bits, kilobits per second. Um, and streaming sites like Idagio can accommodate that, which is great. So we make our recordings available for streaming and everything from that highest possible quality to CD quality to MP3s. But even there, we'll do 320 kilobits per second for which is the highest quality you can get in an MP3. Yeah.
Can one generalize and say that your recordings or recordings in general aspire to sound as they would in a concert hall? Or is recording technology and the aesthetic of recording different because the space where it will be heard, the music will be heard, is either in a room or perhaps just in between the ears and the head? If someone's wearing plugins, I don't even know what they're called because I don't use them. I like music in a room.
Yeah, in general, we like to go for a concert hall aesthetic, often chamber music hall, and we have some wonderful ones to record in here in Chicago. But there are exceptions. Recordings by, especially our contemporary recordings with groups like Eighth Blackbird and Third Coast Percussion, those often require more isolation and a more quote unquote produced sound,
Mm-hmm.
which is not my expertise. Those are the ones I tend not to be the producer for.
And how is recording the human voice different from recording musical instruments?
I'm not sure it is that different. It's it's the same process. Now my engineer has a particular microphone he loves to use lately on vocal recordings, which is one of those RCA 44s, the kind that Frank Sinatra used to record on.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So, and he has a vintage one of those he uses a lot. But the approach is essentially the same in terms of you want to capture the voice, the way the singer imagines he or she should sound. Now, when you're doing an opera recording, it's not just one mic; it's an array of microphones, and there's often movement in between them to try to give a sense of the actual movement of a production. I
Mm-hmm.
remember when we did the L'Amant Anonyme of the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, and we used the Little Opera Hall at DePaul, which is where they had done the production. So that was very
Mm-hmm.
convenient. And Bill had the mics way above, going, sort of pointing down, which worked particularly well for the baritone because the guy's like 6'6". But uh, yeah, so but in general, I look at vocal music the same way I would look at other music, just trying to get the best possible sound. Yeah.
Your mother very famously loved vocal music. She loved opera. And Cedille now has a special fund, I think you can call it, for vocal recordings named for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Would you tell me more about that?
Yeah, well, it was we have every year our and annual fundraising gala, Soirée Cedille, which is how we raise a lot of our funds. And it just happened that in 2022, it's usually in early to mid-September. In fact, this year it's on my birthday, September 8th. But in 2022, it happened to fall on September 18th, which was the second anniversary of my mother's passing. And we thought, well, we need to do something really special here. And we came up with this idea to celebrate Mom's love of vocal music by creating this fund specifically for that in her name. And we also made a commitment that we would release at least one vocal recording each year under that. And we've actually hugely exceeded that lately. And that opera I mentioned, the L'Amant Anonyme, was actually the first one made with funds from the Ruth Bader Ginsburg Fund. And this is a classical period composer, contemporary of Mozart's. In fact, his opera sounds a lot like some of Mozart's operas, but interestingly, it's from 1780, before Mozart had even written Idomeneo. So it's a really quite amazing thing. I just think this is an opera my mother would absolutely have loved. So was a really, really appropriate first use of the fund in her name.
And it stars Nicole Cabell, who is a Chicago area wonderful artist.
Yep.
And, so when you do something like that, you try to find artists from Chicago, even if the composer is not from Chicago. How does that work?
Well, I mean, it's all based on the Haymarket Opera Company's production, and they are a local opera company specializing in period performance, and not just period instrument players, but also even in their staging, they actually go for a period feel with the costumes and scenery, and even the acting method is periods. They're very conscientious about that. And they assembled a tremendous cast that pretty much was all artists either in Chicago or with a connection to Chicago for that one. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Not every single aspect of a recording has to be, Chicago, but in this case, it really was.
What are some of the others in the RBG vocal series?
Well, most recently, we released an album with baritone Will Liverman called Show Me the Way, which is his tribute to women in classical music. It's all female composers, and except for the pianist, all female collaborators. So he does duets with Nicole Cabell and Janae Bridges and Renee Fleming, which is pretty cool.
Renee Fleming is not from Chicago, but for many years she was the artistic advisor to the Lyric Opera Chicago.
Very good. Yeah. and like Nicole Cabell, Janae Bridges is a product of the Ryan Opera Center here at the Lyric Opera of Chicago. So, and I think Mom would have loved the female composers aspect of this. And it's both contemporary, including, like I said, Sarah Kirkland Snyder specifically wrote a duet for Will and Renee Fleming for this album, which is pretty cool. But also historical Chicago composers like Margaret Bonds and Florence Price. So it really runs the gamut of all of those. So that's certainly one. We came out with an oratorio, which includes 4 vocal soloists, as well as combined adult and children's choirs called Terra Nostra. Oh, look, I just happen to have it right here. By a Chicago composer, Stacy Garup. That was another recent vocal release on CD. And in fact, this month, August 2024, we're releasing an album with an incredible tenor named Ian Kojara from Chicago and still has a home here, although he did the Lindemann program at the Met, not the program at Lyric. He is the Helden tenor of the future, by the way. Unbelievable voice. But he chose a really interesting program of composers whose lives were destroyed by the Holocaust or the anti-Semitism leading up to it in the case of Franz Schrecker. It also has Alexander Zemlinsky, Victor Ullmann, and this amazing Vyacheslava Kapralova, this Czech composer who fled Prague for France because of the Nazis and died of either tuberculosis or typhoid fever. We're not sure which in Montpellier.
He was very young when she died.
He was 25, but still left an amazing amount of music, particularly songs. And those are some of the highlights of this album, and it's just also just incredible singing. I'm really proud to have produced this one and look forward, to people getting to hear it later this month. Yeah.
Well, as we were talking, I began to think about other singers I know personally or who I admire with Chicago links. And among them are Quinn Kelsey, the wonderful
Oh,
baritone,
yes. Yes,
and
yes.
Sandra Radvanovsky, the wonderful, wonderful soprano, and Matthew Polenzani, the wonderful tenor,
Mhm.
are all Chicago area people. There are many more. I don't want to limit to those three, but I hope that gradually you're going to work them into your
Yeah.
circle.
I think, one thing I should mention, one of the things that the label has become increasingly strong about over the years is helping artists build careers. So when we can start with somebody when they're young, like Will Liverman or Ian Kojara, that really, and then work with them throughout as they build their careers. That's really the ideal. So an artist who's more established, well, we welcome them, of course. I think they have other recording opportunities, and I mean, by now Will does too, for example, and I'm sure Ian will soon as well. And he actually Ian already is on at least one European opera recording. But I think those are the special cases. Now, I will mention I've put the bug in Quinn's ear a couple of times because I am a huge fan of his. In Santa Fe Cup, I think it was 2 summers ago now. He did them, and this is unusual for a relatively young singer, but he did the best Falstaff I think I will ever hear. It
Mm-hmm.
was just incredible. I mean, every nuance, I mean, every word, every nuance was there.
Yep.
Yeah.
He's a marvelous, marvelous singer. I heard him when he was very, very young and in Chicago, and he just struck me as I have to follow who this person is. And he turned out also to be a really wonderful guy, in addition to being a
Yeah.
wonderful singer. Um, have I know that a certain fellow named Barack Obama is a music lover, as is his wife Michelle, who I adore. I adore both of them, and he he's something of an arbiter in terms of music. He's also profoundly in love with and loyal to Chicago, especially the neighborhood you're in. And I believe he's building his presidential library there, if I'm correct.
Well, I should note,
And
I put the label in Hyde Park, but I live in Edgewater now, which is about as far north of downtown as Hyde Park is south.
okay, but I'm speaking of Hyde Park and you of Chicago, that area. Um, has he expressed an interest? And I'm just thinking of this as I'm saying it. I would love Michelle Obama to narrate something as part of a musical performance, and
Huh.
why not Aaron Copland and doing Abraham Lincoln, which can be narrated by a woman. And Abe Lincoln, though not born in Illinois, was really from Illinois. And I'm just putting this idea out there. You don't have to say yes or no now, but
Well,
I would love to hear her narrate something.
I'll certainly keep that in mind. Actually, we just did something with narration. By the way, Steve Robinson, who you mentioned, did some narration for us on an album of songs, all based on Billy Collins poems, and then
Mm-hmm.
some were songs and some were narration over music, and he did those and did an incredible job with those. Um, but actually, we are releasing in October a piece by Michael Abels, who is now well known for his film scores for the Jordan Peele films like Out and Us. And actually, there's this new Star Wars series, The Acolyte, that he wrote the music for. So he's really made a name for himself in Hollywood. I'm very proud that Cedille was the first label on which his music was ever recorded. We did a piece of his called Global Warming with the Chicago Sinfonietta in the very early 2000s. But he wrote 30 years ago a set of pieces called Frederick's Fables, based on children's stories, all with the mice as their characters. And they're absolutely adorable stories. And these, I kid you not, these are the modern day Peter and the Wolf. They are that
Mm-hmm.
good. And in that case, we wanted to, and actually, two of them had been done over Minnesota Public Radio with the James Earl Jones, which is no longer available. But we wanted to have a similar voice to that for this recording. We end up going with I don't know if you know the bass baritone Michael Samuel.
Sure.
Uh, yeah,
Yeah.
terrific voice. So he's actually doing the narration on that.
Yeah, good. Um, when I was growing up, I'm about 9 years older than you are. When I was growing up and had my first recordings, LPs, long-term playing 33s, as we called them, um, these records came in albums, and the albums had art on one side of kind of visual art, and a lot of writing on the other. And sometimes there was an insert, and these were known as liner notes. And a lot of the education that happened for experts, but also for young people, new people like myself, came with the liner notes. And with the advent of compact discs in the 1980s, the liner notes became more compact as well. Sometimes they would have booklets, sometimes they would just disappear. At a certain point, with the advent of the internet, people would read liner notes online. But often, liner notes were written to accompany the recording that was present. So, not just Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, but this version of Beethoven's Fifth conducted by George Solti and his approach with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Or I learned a lot of Bruckner actually through the Chicago Symphony because we didn't have much of it in New York. We had Mahler here, but
So many.
I
Yes.
but if I wanted to learn some Bruckner, I would have to go to the Chicago recordings and hear the Chicago Symphony, which is fine with the brass magnificent and so on. But liner notes or information that's specific to a recording don't really exist now, or if they do, they're very different. Would you talk about their value or whether they're not valuable anymore? I've never really asked someone about liner notes and their role in a recording.
No, they're very valuable to us. We take them very seriously, and we, for each recording, sometimes they're written by the artists. Other times we hire somebody, like, for example, the recording this month with Ian Kojara, we hired Roger Pines of their of Lyric Opera of Chicago and Northwestern University to write about these composers and their songs in some real depth, because we felt that that a program like this required that level of scholarship. So yeah, and I personally edit every single all the program notes in our albums. We have a sort of, I call it, Cedille style. So
What
I
is the
insist.
state style?
Well, for example, I insist on the Oxford comma.
Okay.
Yeah, so things like that. I'm very particular, but I never publish anything without getting full approval of the writers, so that they're happy with what I've done to what they've started with, and in general they seem to like what I do. So, but yeah, no, that's a hugely important aspect, and in fact, it's always in the printed booklet, but we also make the full program notes available on the web page on our website. On the each album has its own page, and you can either there's a link. It says you'll have like the first paragraph on the front of the page, and it says click for full album notes. So you can click, and right there on the page you can get the whole. Or there's also you click here for the booklet, and then you can get a PDF of the entire booklet and read the notes that way. That's a very important aspect of our recordings. And when it's a vocal recording, we also do text and translations, which can be quite a hassle at times, getting permission and getting proper translations, and it takes a lot. It takes a lot of effort, but we think it's worth it.
Should someone read the liner notes ahead of hearing a recording, or should they hear the music once and then read the notes?
It's a great question. I think different people feel differently. I famously hate quote unquote spoilers. So generally, like if I know I'm going to a movie, I will not watch the trailer because I don't want them giving away stuff that I'm going to see in the movie. So there's definitely something to be said for listen first, then read about it. But if it's unfamiliar repertory, I can see people saying, "No, I want to know something about this before I play it." So I could go either way on that.
I always say music first.
Okay.
So whether it's a vocal recording or an orchestral recording, whatever, I will just, or even in a concert hall, I will want to hear the music. And then if I'm in the concert hall, I will read the program after.
Interesting.
Pardon me?
I would say in a concert, I will usually at least glance at the notes because you only get one shot. One of the nice things about a recording is you can listen, read, and listen again.
True.
So sometimes I want
Uh,
to lead the roadmap at a concert. Yeah.
I only look at the notes in a program to know how long the piece is.
I do that for sure. Yeah.
So that, is it 21 minutes? Is it 48 minutes? It
Yeah.
just know that context. But I try, same with plays, and as you said about films, I with theater, I don't read reviews ahead of time.
Right. Same.
I will go to a play if I'm interested in the playwright or one of the actors or the company that produces it. It's kind of like having faith in a brand.
Mhm.
But a lot of times I know absolutely nothing and I go in completely cold. And that's fine too. When I teach, I always try to explain to people it's not about understanding,
Mhm.
about whatever it is that has touched you, taking that away. And then if you want, you can study it more. So I would then read the program,
Mhm.
for example. But I don't want anyone conditioning my thought process about my experience
Uh,
of a work of art. So what have I left out about Cedille that you would want to talk about?
oh my goodness. Well, I think one thing we should talk about is representing a city like of Chicago that's such a diverse city allows us to have really diverse range of artists, both performers and composers. And we're really proud of that. Of course, we've talked a little bit about Will Liverman and Nicole Cabell. We have the Mexican-born pianist Jorge Federico Osorio, who is just unbelievable poet at the piano, as well as has the chops to play the really knuckle-busting stuff as well. Um, Henry Fogel thinks he's one of the 10 best pianists in the world, so that tells you something. And then composers like, I mean, there's lots of female composers, like Clarissa Saad and Stacey Garip, I mentioned, and African American composers like Shauna Pebolo, who's based at Wheaton College. We've done a number of works of his, and he's a real rising star. So I think that's one. And this all started for us well, way back when we did an album with Rachel Barden Pine, the violinist, who is the most prolific soloist on the label, and she performs both standard repertory on her now Guarneri del Gesù, but also is also a period instrument specialist. In fact, one of her most popular albums is an album of the Vivaldi Viola d'Amore concertos. So she plays all kinds of instruments. But one of her first recordings on the label was a recording of violin concertos by Black composers of the 18th and 19th centuries, which was actually my first introduction to the amazing Chevalier de Saint-Georges. Um, uh, and then later we did a series with Paul Freeman, who founded the Chicago Sinfonietta, the nation's most diverse orchestra, called the African Heritage Symphonic Series. This was a follow-up to he did a whole series of LPs, as you know, for Columbia of Black composers dating back to the 18th century. We decided to concentrate on the 20th century with this 3-volume, 3 CD set. And so the first CD was the first part of the century with composers like William Grant Still and Samuel Coleridge Taylor. And then the second CD had music from the middle of the century. And then the third was right up to the end of the 20th century. And that was my first introduction to composers like Michael Abels and amazing Chicago composer at the end of his career, Coleridge Taylor Perkinson, who, yes, was named for Samuel Coleridge Taylor. So that, and we've been proud of our championing of diverse music for the longest time. Didn't really think about it that much until, like the rest of us, the George Floyd killing sort of focused everybody's attention, and we realized, whoa, we have a real story to tell here and real commitment. So we actually created a vision statement to talk about our historical and continuing commitment to diversity in classical music. And so that's an important focus of the label. Now, I also mentioned building careers. and the label started with some artists who were, you know, well established in terms of, you know, the older, like Dimitri Paperno and Easley Blackwood, but more and more it's gravitated towards championing younger musicians as well. In fact, we a few years ago had something we called our emerging artist competition, where we put an age limit on it and had various artists and ensembles compete, and we ended up with this. The winner was this incredible young saxophonist, Julian Velasco, and the prize, of course, was you got to make your debut recording on CD. That was very successful, and we're actually having another one right now. We're in the middle of our call for submissions. We'll choose our semifinalists and then have the live semifinal and final rounds in May of next year, and the finals will actually be live streamed as well, and WFMT will be our partner in that. So those are some, I think, of the important initiatives going forward with the label.
I just thought of an absolutely marvelous Chicago area soprano that I should have mentioned sooner. Eileen Perez, the Mexican American, is from Chicago. And I'm just picturing now a recording with her and Quinn Kelsey. You can do the repertory, but there's so much overlap that they have that even, you know, very mainstream popular opera stuff that your mother loved and I love and millions of people love, that would be a nice double recording.
Well, and I should add that Eileen and her husband, Solomon Howard, are both great favorites of Mom's, or were, I should say.
Solomon Howard is from Washington.
Yeah, I know that, but right. I'm just saying, yes, I'm very familiar with them and her. In fact, she did an incredible Rusalka at Santa Fe last season. Can't say I was that crazy for the production itself, but she made up for any shortcomings in that respect with her incredible singing and acting. Yeah.
Chicago, you touched on this a bit. Chicago is a very prominent Mexican population, well before other cities in the North did, certainly well before New York City. There was a very famous restaurant owned by Rick Bayless, who's not of Mexican origin, but was considered the best Mexican, one of them in the country, in Chicago. And Eileen Perez is of Mexican origin. Have you explored that on your recording company, the Mexican presence in Chicago?
Well, I mentioned Jorge Federico Osorio, who of course is from Mexico City. And actually Julian Velasco is part Mexican, the winner of our competition. That was, you know, not by design, of course. He just happened to, you know, wow everybody at the competition. But so, I mean, Chicago is such a melting pot for different ethnicities, of course. We have our wonderful Armenian performers, pianist Marta Aznavourian and her sister Ani Aznavourian, who even did an album of Armenian composers called Gems for Armenia. And of course, Rachel Barden-Pine has been a champion of Scottish music. And we even did an album of hers called Scottish Fantasies, including where she took the Brooks Scottish Fantasy and actually brought back and ornamented it with the way a Scottish fiddle player would ornament the solo part. So it sort of took it a little bit out of its Germanicness and back into it, you know, more into the maybe even more Scottish. And actually, the album ends with this crazy medley of Scots tunes that Rachel co-wrote with and performs with Alistair Fraser, who's a famous Scottish fiddler. And to hear them sort of, you know, sort of the battling fiddles on that piece is just wild.
Another fiddler from Chicago, you're too young to have met him, I think, was Jack Benny.
Oh, I'm a big fan of old radio, and
let's
I love
talk about that a bit, because
yeah.
As I said, I went to college in Chicago partially and in Wisconsin, north of there. And at night in Wisconsin, where there were nothing but cows between me and Chicago, radio stations would arrive from Chicago to my little radio in Madison. And I would hear wonderful music of old-time radio. I'm forgetting the name now of the television station, WGN maybe, that did old-time television before anyone else did old-time television. Chicago has a wonderful propensity to honor classic American things that other people seem to have forgotten, like not
Well,
building a new ballpark. The Chicago Cubs keep their beautiful ballpark, that kind of thing, which I really love about Chicago.
and Chuck Hayden had that wonderful old time radio show here,
Yeah.
and WNIB, the station out at in DuPage, still carries on that tradition on weekends. But
Mhm.
actually, it's funny you meant. I'll tell you a funny story because WGN Radio used to play the old time radio at like midnight. Those shows. And we were doing some recording sessions in a church in Evanston that went really late. And at one point we started to hear these voices and we couldn't figure out what was going on until we realized the one of the speakers in the church was somehow picking up it was WBBM. That's right. It was WBBM radio back then, the CBS station, was picking up Chuck Shaden's old time radio station. Happily, it was during the winter, so we had enough heavy coats to cover the speaker, so it didn't get into the recording. But yeah, no, I used to listen to Jack Benny, and of course those great routines with where he played the violin, and Mel Blanc would be the violin teacher with that awful French accent. Monsieur Benny, you are sounding worse than ever.
Jack Benny, I think it was Yasha Heifetz and not Isaac Stern, did some old recordings
Yes,
and broadcasts with Yasha Heifetz that were pricelessly funny.
yes.
And he was not from Chicago, he was nearby, but
Jack
basically
Benny, Waukegan.
Waukegan, yeah. And so, I mean, I'm a New Yorker. I love it. You're a New Yorker, but I love extolling the virtues of Chicago because it is really so rich in culture and diversity.
Yep.
And that's part of why I wanted to talk to you because you hold the banner very high for your adopted city. Do you think of yourself as a Chicagoan or New Yorker now?
I mean, I will always say I was born and raised in New York, but I've been a Chicagoan for over 40 years now. So I do feel myself a Chicagoan at this point.
Do you
My
do
daughter
anything?
actually took the opposite trip. I should note, my daughter's born here, have gone on to school in New York, and my older daughter is a dedicated Brooklynite now.
As one should be. um, do you do anything in terms of recording or maybe in terms of artistic planning with the Art Institute of Chicago, which is a magnificent museum along the lake?
We haven't yet, but I always hold those possibilities open. We certainly have had we've done collaborations with other museums. We've done things at the Chicago Historical Society, for example. And actually, I mentioned that Terra Nostra oratorio, which is it means our planet, and it's all about man's relationship. Sets some wonderful poetry, a lot of Walt Whitman, and certainly raises the issues of climate change. And we actually did a release event for that at a little museum here in Chicago called the Climate Action Museum.
And where is that?
It's right on the Chicago River where the Wacker Drive turns north-south. So actually on Riverside, it's actually, the address is actually Riverside.
Mhm.
So it's like literally a space on the river. It's a really beautiful space.
On my next visit, I'm going there. Jim Ginsburg, just tell me, I can talk to you about many, many things. Is there anything else that I didn't cover that I should have brought up?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, there's so many artists I didn't get to talk about. So many of our chamber ensembles, like the
Me
Pacific
too.
Red and Lincoln
Me too.
Trio, and
Me too.
I did sneak in the back here my favorite historical Chicago composer, Leo Sowerby, whose music we've that's a book biography of him, which I'm proud to be quoted in the epilogue. Very important Chicago composer in the 1920s and 30s, was actually the American composer most programmed by American orchestras, and not just the Chicago Symphony, but he was pretty much the composer in residence throughout de facto under Frederick Stock's music directorship, and a composer whose music really should be better known. And we've done what we can so far on CD with his Second Symphony and a lot of his tone poems, and an album devoted that includes to the two works he wrote for the Paul Whiteman Band at the same time that Gershwin was writing Rhapsody in Blue for them, and his Pulitzer Prize winning piece, the Canticle of the Sun, based on St. Francis, which is on an album called The Pulitzer Project, which I'm particularly proud of. It's got 3 of the first 4 Pulitzer Prize winners in music, 2 of which were not recorded at that point. The William Schumann, the first prize winner, A Free Song, Walt Whitman based cantata, very much a piece of the World War II era, and the Sowerby, both of which are for chorus and orchestra, and this is the Grant Park Chorus and Orchestra. And in between is a better known piece, not a premiere recording, Copeland's Appalachian Spring. But I would put that recording of Appalachian Spring up against any of them. It is just spectacularly played and conducted by Carlos Calmar, who is our outgoing now music director of the Grant Park Orchestra after 25 years.
So the website is CEDILLE Records .org. Did I spell that correctly? It is. I have one more question for you.
Yeah.
When you began this in 1989, did you have any idea it would become what it became? Not in terms of success, but in terms of ambition and scope and what you've created.
No, I mean, to be honest, when I started, again, I had this idea, that all these Chicago musicians, and Chicago is a city that's famous for it's got folk and jazz and, of course, blues labels, and it was just so weird that classical was this black hole. So that was, the initial impetus. But frankly, at the beginning, I was just looking to make good records, the kind of records I would actually enjoy hearing as a listener. And then more and more, the focus of the label got to be about really these musicians and their repertories and their careers. And I like to say that musicians come to us with the projects they really want to do. I should mention that we do not believe in making people exclusive. We have musicians do one album at a time. They come to us with their ideas. I don't go out there pitching repertoire. And some of them do have other opportunities, and that's great for them. But what they say to me is, we'll do other labels will call us and we'll do whatever they want to record. When we have an idea of our own, we come to you. And that's incredibly gratifying. And there's so many stories I could tell, about how Rachel Barden Pine actually got her violin through a CD recording. Her Brahms and Joachim violin concertos led to her getting the permanent loan of that Guarneri del Gesù. The incredible period instrument ensemble Trio Settecento actually was formed to make a CD recording, and it was initially just under the names of the musicians. Then people started asking Rachel, when's your trio going to come perform? And she said, my trio? Oh, okay, we'll form a trio. So that became Trio Settecento. Or Stacey Garup. One of the most gratifying things for me is that she says that was because of our recordings that she was able to quit her teaching job, which was at Roosevelt, and become a full-time freelance composer, because through our recordings, she was getting enough calls for commissions that she could afford to do that. So the stories like that is why I do what I do. And it really makes this labor of love of mine it's so wonderful when I see the benefits, or the musicians tell me about the benefits it has for them.
And you have created an artistic legacy too, which is a wonderful thing.
I think over the breadth of the catalog, which is getting close to 250 recordings now, I think that is true. And the sum of it, I think really speaks well to the whole classical music scene of Chicago, beyond lyric opera and the symphony. In fact, right behind me, you'll notice that poster is actually the cover of a CD we created for one of WFMT's fund drive, where they said, we'd like to make a fund drive gift based on your recordings of Chicago artists.
Jim, I have one more question I've been meaning to ask you. Your wife is a singer. Tell me about her, please.
Not just a singer, but a singer and a composer. And I actually met her through recording. I should note that we were friends and colleagues for 20 years before we actually became a couple, because when we started, we were both involved with other people. In fact, Patrice was married with children, and I was close to being engaged at that point. But yeah, we started with a recording project with the Rembrandt Chamber Players, where they did this album featuring David Schrader, one of our charter artists. He was the keyboard player in the chamber group, and of course he specialized in harpsichord. And we did an album of 20th century works that involved harpsichord, including this set of early songs of Dominic Argento called Six Elizabethan Songs. And they said, we want to bring in this soprano. I think you'll like her. Well, I was completely bowled over at the recording sessions. Later learned that she had actually studied composition under Dominic Argento at University of Minnesota. And over time, we got to making various albums together, and it was a friendship that eventually blossomed into a romance. And lately, Patrice's albums have concentrated on her composing, including an album called Notorious RBG in Song, which is the centerpiece is a song cycle that she wrote. It's a quote, a portrait of Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 9 songs. And it was great fun as she was composing these pieces. My mother would actually find opportunities for these to be premiered, sometimes at Glimmerglass, sometimes during her opera and law talks, sometimes at various judicial conferences she was involved in. And there are other pieces on that album as well. There's a piece, a very moving piece based on my father's letter that we found in his hospital room, his last letter, a love letter to my mother that Stacey Garrop said, called My Dearest Ruth. There's a selection from Derek Wang's Scalia Ginsburg opera on there. So, but yeah, it's been pretty wonderful for me that what started as a musical colleague relationship blossomed into a marriage, and frankly, some of my very favorite vocal recordings.
What was Patrice's last name?
Oh, Patrice Michaels. Yes, actually, on her very earliest recording, she had her married name, Patrice Michaels Betty, which is a problem on some streaming sites. You end up with her, two different catalogs for her, which is unfortunate. Mm-hmm. But actually, the first album she made under her, when she got rid of the married/divorced name, is a particular favorite of mine. It's all French repertoire, or French language anyway, because it's a Benjamin Britten cycle on there, called La Vie est une parade. And just amazing singing, I can highly recommend that one. And people ask what's your favorite recording. It's like asking what's your favorite child, but this actually is a particular favorite. Just such wonderful singing, and the fact that it's all French, and given what a Francophile I am, given what I named the label, of course, is a nice bonus.
Well, Jim Ginsburg, thank you so very much. It's been a pleasure to have you on this program, to have you as my 225th guest, and keep up the good work. And I look forward to hearing every musical product that you and your company create from the wonderful city of Chicago.
Appreciate it. Thanks so much, Fred.